Across the long centuries of medieval Europe, justice was never simply a matter of law. It was a spectacle, a ritual, and often a warning carved into the memory of entire towns. Punishment took place in open squares, on bridges, in marketplaces, and before the gates of castles where life and death could be decided before sunrise. The world between the 12th and 15th centuries was shaped by feudal authority, religious courts, wandering magistrates, and local customs that varied from region to region, yet all shared a belief that suffering could restore order. In an age where literacy was rare and official proclamations reached only a few, punishment became a form of communication. The sight of the scaffold, the wheel, the stake, or the block served as a universal language, one that needed no written record to be understood. This documentary explores the most inhumane public executions of that era, tracing how they emerged, why they persisted, and what they reveal about a society governed by fear, faith, and necessity. Each chapter follows the slow, deliberate rhythm of medieval life, examining methods that shaped not only local memory, but the culture of punishment across Europe. We begin where spectacle and suffering converged most visibly. The breaking wheel, known in Latin as rota, stood at the center of many medieval European punishments, turning the quiet of marketplaces into scenes of dread. Its use is documented as early as the year 1108 inches parts of the Holy Roman Empire, where chroniclers in Mainz recorded the execution of a band of thieves who were broken upon the wheel under the authority of Count Adalbert. By the mid-13th century, references appear in France, notably during the reign of Louis IX, where the wheel was declared suitable for crimes considered too severe for simple hanging. The method spread to cities such as Cologne, Bruges, Ghent, and Nuremberg, each adapting the ritual to its customs, while maintaining the same dreadful intent. A public square transformed entirely when the wheel was set. Witnesses gathered as early as dawn, filling narrow stone streets leading toward the wooden platform. In some towns, church bells tolled slowly, as they did in 1276 during the execution of a murderer in Strasbourg, marking the gravity of what was about to unfold. The condemned, escorted by guards or local militias, walked through a crowd that parted not silently but with murmurs, prayers, and sometimes insults. Medieval accounts describe a mixture of curiosity and fear, children hoisted onto shoulders, merchants closing stalls, travelers stopping their horses to watch. Punishment was both a spectacle and a moral lesson, and attendance was considered part of civic life. The wheel itself was simple in design but terrifying in use. Built from heavy timber and often reinforced with iron, it resembled the frame of a cart, but stripped of its practical purpose. Its spokes created openings through which limbs could be threaded, stretched, and immobilized. In regions such as Bavaria, executioners used an iron bar, called a cudgel, to shatter the bones of the condemned. The breaking began at the lower limbs and moved upwards with deliberate pace. Each strike echoed across the square, slow and measured. Chroniclers from 14th century Bruges record how the crowd sometimes counted the blows aloud, not in cruelty alone, but because they understood the rhythm: legs, arms, ribs, and finally the chest. Yet the ritual was not identical everywhere. In Paris, records from 1315 describe a variation in which the condemned was first tied to a board and the wheel was rolled over the body, crushing bones beneath its weight. In the territories of Saxony, the wheel might be lifted and dropped upon the patient. Some executions required that the victim remain alive after the breaking, placed atop a high pole for onlookers to witness the slow decline. In 1387, a man named Heinrich von Bicken was broken in this manner near Frankfurt. His body displayed for nearly 2 days before death finally came. Such displays served not only to punish, but to warn travelers approaching the city gates. The executioner played a central role, moving with practiced skill rather than improvisation. Manuals from the late medieval period highlight how each blow needed to be delivered in a specific sequence to avoid premature death, which was considered a failure of duty. The condemned was expected to endure long enough for the ritual to complete its moral purpose. Some towns even kept executioners under guild-like arrangements, regulating their conduct and ensuring that the ritual maintained its structure. Where the Catholic Church held strong influence, priests sometimes accompanied the condemned, offering confession or urging repentance, though the wheel itself belonged to secular justice. Still, accounts from 1,291 inches Toulouse mention clerics present to observe that penance had been offered. The wheel's place in public consciousness became so strong that it influenced medieval imagery and metaphor. To say that someone faced the wheel implied not only death but humiliation, suffering, and the stripping away of social standing. Criminals placed upon the wheel were often denied the burial customs granted to others. Instead, their remains were left exposed, wings of black birds circling overhead. Travelers passing through regions like Burgundy or Swabia described such sights in letters, noting how the silhouettes of bodies upon poles marked not just the boundary of a town but the authority of its laws. In some unusual cases, names of victims became known across wider regions. One such account appears in a 14th century chronicle from Liège, describing the execution of a man called Gérard de la Haye, whose repeated escapes from imprisonment made his final breaking a spectacle of considerable attention. His name appears in several records, suggesting that the event was retold through villages as cautionary tale. Although Gérard's crime banditry along the Meuse was common enough in the era, the manner of his death elevated him to a figure of local memory. The breaking wheel's endurance across medieval Europe reveals more than the cruelty of the age. It demonstrates a society structured around visible authority. Without mass communication, printing, or broader literacy, the wheel served as a physical declaration of consequence. Its placement in open spaces was intentional. Just as markets represented life and exchange, the wheel represented the boundary of acceptable behavior. A person approaching such a scene could understand immediately the message. Order would be maintained no matter the cost. By the late 15th century, variations of the wheel continued to be used from the Iberian Peninsula to the Baltic, and though later centuries would modify punishments or replace them, the wheel's imprint remained. For medieval Europe, it was not simply a tool, it was an emblem of justice shaped through fear, ritual, and the expectation that the community must witness suffering to confirm its own stability. Fire was one of the earliest instruments used in medieval Europe to display punishment as a symbol rather than a mere method. Its presence in public executions served a dual purpose: purification and destruction. While the breaking wheel created prolonged suffering, burning at the stake transformed the public square into a scene of irreversible finality. The glow of flames and the rising smoke communicated a message that required no proclamation, a message intended for villagers, travelers, and future generations who would hear accounts of such events carried along trade routes and spoken in markets. The setting of a stake ritual began long before the fire was lit. Wood had to be gathered, dried, and arranged with precision, often in circular layers that reached as high as a person's chest. In some towns, straw or resin was woven into the structure to ensure the flames spread evenly. These preparations took place in open spaces that could accommodate large gatherings. Medieval squares were not designed for silence. They echoed with footsteps, voices, and the occasional clatter of carts. As the execution drew nearer, the noise shifted. People gathered slowly, choosing vantage points from which to witness what was considered both judgment and instruction. The condemned individual, often accused of crimes tied to public fear, arson, treason, or offenses perceived as threats to the community, was brought forward with a solemnity that contrasted the murmuring crowd. Bound by rope or iron shackles, the figure was led through the same streets used for festivals and processions. The path served as a reminder of how thin the line could be between ordinary life and the rituals of punishment. The presence of guards or militiamen signaled that the event was not an act of cruelty alone, but a fulfillment of communal order. A raised platform sometimes accompanied the stake, not for the condemned, but for officials overseeing the ritual. Their role was to ensure that the act followed the established custom, emphasizing the authority that guided every aspect of public life. Fire, unlike other methods, could not be reversed. Once lit, it consumed thoroughly, turning the scene into one of transformation rather than endurance. The finality of fire made it a method reserved for cases considered beyond redemption. The crowd's reaction varied from town to town. Some gathered in uneasy silence. Others spoke in hushed tones about the accused, repeating rumors or retelling the events that had led to this day. Such retellings often shaped the memory of the moment more than any official record. A traveler passing through might hear one version, while a merchant would repeat another, each story shifting subtly as it moved across regions. Public executions lived in these stories, shaped by community perception as much as by legal judgment. When the condemned was tied to the stake, the final preparations began. Executioners moved with routine precision, adjusting ropes so the figure would remain upright until the flames took hold. The ignition point varied. In some regions, fire was lit at the perimeter, slowly encircling the victim. In others, it began beneath the feet, rising upwards in a vertical column. These differences reflected local beliefs about suffering, penance, and the importance of making the ritual visible to all who watched. A fire that advanced slowly allowed the crowd to witness each stage of the punishment. A fire lit directly beneath the condemned carried swifter force but equal symbolism. The moment the flames caught, the atmosphere changed. Movement within the crowd slowed. The crackling of burning wood replaced conversation. As the fire rose, witnesses saw the figure transform into an outline surrounded by shifting light. Medieval life was closely tied to elemental forces: earth, water, wind, and fire. Fire, with its ability to destroy and purify, was seen as a force that extended beyond earthly judgment. It reached toward beliefs about the afterlife, salvation, and the consequences of actions left unspoken. The scent of smoke filled the square, weaving into the clothing of those who stood too close. Children who witnessed the scene remembered the smell long after the details blurred. Merchants who had paused in their work resumed tasks later, with the memory of the fire lingering in their thoughts. Fire left impressions not only on the condemned, but on everyone present. Even those who claimed indifference carried with them the weight of having witnessed a ritual meant to shape behavior. Some accounts describe how the fire's brightness reflected off nearby buildings, timber frames glowing briefly, stone walls absorbing the shifting patterns of light. Towns often placed stakes in open fields or near rivers to avoid risk of embers spreading, but the boundary between safety and danger remained thin. Villagers remembered times when flames leaped too high or wind carried sparks unpredictably, turning punishment into a cautionary tale about the power they attempted to wield. As the fire completed its work, officials stepped forward to examine the remains, confirming that the sentence had reached its end. The ashes were sometimes left in place until morning, allowing those who had not witnessed the execution to see evidence of what had occurred. In other instances, the remains were gathered and disposed of in areas outside consecrated ground. Burial customs held deep meaning in medieval life, and denying access to proper rites served as a continuation of the punishment. The stake remained, after the flames died, charred and silent. Over time, the soot and ash blended into the earth, becoming part of the landscape until the structure was replaced for the next execution. Those who passed the site days later might still feel the presence of what had taken place, a memory that attached itself to familiar surroundings. Medieval Europe carried such memories in its roads, its fields, and its marketplaces, each reflecting the values and fears of a time when justice and spectacle were inseparable. Burning at the stake persisted not because of its efficiency, but because of how strongly it communicated meaning. Fire erased the condemned entirely, leaving behind a message felt deeply by all who watched. Punishment was not only a response to wrongdoing, but also a reminder of the community's fragile order. The stake stood as a symbol that actions deemed dangerous or destabilizing could bring consequences as consuming as the flames themselves. Over centuries, this ritual left a mark on medieval memory, shaping how towns understood authority, danger, and the power of public judgment. The scaffold stood as one of the most familiar structures in medieval Europe, rising in the center of public squares, near market stalls, or beside the walls of fortified towns. Unlike methods that demanded prolonged suffering, The axe promised finality delivered in a single moment. Yet the ritual surrounding beheading carried its own weight, shaped by the expectations of the crowd, the precision of the executioner, and the deeper belief that the final stroke reflected the dignity or disgrace of the condemned. The scaffold did not intimidate through drawn-out agony, but through the quiet anticipation that gathered before the blade fell. Preparation for a beheading was deliberate and methodical. Carpenters constructed a raised platform tall enough for the crowd to witness the act clearly. The wood bore marks from past executions, cuts, gouges, and stains. Some scaffolds remained permanent fixtures, while others were assembled only when needed, shaped quickly from timber, and set in familiar open spaces. The block, smoothed by age and use, sat at the platform's center. Its surface bore the history of countless final breaths. For the medieval mind, the block represented a boundary between life and silence, and its presence conveyed a solemnity that required no words. Executioners held an essential role in these ceremonies, moving with calm precision. Their skills were not merely physical, but deeply ceremonial. The axe itself was cleaned, sharpened, and inspected before the event. A dull blade risked turning a moment of finality into spectacle, something feared by both officials and the condemned. Medieval writings describe executioners practicing strokes on logs or sacks of grain to ensure that the blade met its mark with decisive force. Their reputation mattered. A single poorly delivered blow could follow them for years, marking them as careless or incompetent. The condemned walked from their confinement toward the scaffold, under watch of guards, their steps echoing against stone streets. The crowd parted ahead of them, observing with a mix of curiosity and restraint. Some looked with pity, others with relief that justice, as they understood it, had been served. Medieval communities saw punishment as a shared responsibility, and witness to the event was part of acknowledging the order that governed them. Even those who wished to look away found themselves drawn by the gravity of the moment. At the base of the scaffold, the condemned paused. Some said a final prayer, others maintained silence, accepting the ritual that now unfolded around them. The climb to the platform stood symbolic, each step marking a transition from worldly presence to the threshold of judgment. The executioner waited at the top, hands steady, stance prepared. Assistants sometimes stood nearby holding cloths or pails of sand to absorb what followed. These small details, quiet gestures by individuals who played roles rarely recorded, formed the unseen structure of medieval justice. Upon reaching the block, the condemned knelt or was guided into place. The atmosphere shifted as the crowd fell into quiet. In that silence, the ritual moved forward with clarity. The executioner lifted the axe, sometimes offering a brief acknowledgement of the moment. No lengthy declarations accompanied the act. Medieval life valued efficiency in these ceremonies. The crowd understood the meaning without explanation. Some records mention the condemned offering final words, often brief, shaped more by resignation than defiance. The block awaited their final gesture of stillness. When the axe descended, time seemed to contract. The sound of the blow carried across the square, sharp and unmistakable. The act, though swift, left a lasting impression. Witnesses often remembered the exact moment for years, describing it in terms that captured not only the physical action, but the emotional weight it carried. Medieval communities lived close to the rituals of life and death, and beheading reinforced the fragility of that balance. The executioner, trained and focused, stepped back immediately, allowing the ritual to continue without hesitation. The severed head was sometimes displayed briefly, raised for the crowd to see. This gesture served as proof of justice fulfilled and reinforced the authority of officials. Whether the condemned had been noble or common, the act unified the spectators in a shared acknowledgement of law and consequence. Officials recorded the event or simply marked it in memory, depending on the customs of the region. Some towns maintained detailed logs, others relied on the collective understanding of those who witnessed the act firsthand. After the execution, the body was removed from the scaffold and carried away for burial or disposal, depending on the customs applied to the specific crime. Some were granted simple burials, others were denied consecrated ground. These post-execution decisions reflected not only the offense, but the values of the community. Those observing slowly dispersed, returning to daily tasks with the memory of the scaffold lingering just beneath the surface of ordinary life. The event imprinted itself upon the town's rhythm, shaping how justice was seen and understood. The scaffold itself remained a visible reminder of what had taken place. Whether taken down or left standing, it symbolized authority, boundary, and finality. Travelers entered towns and saw its frame, recognizing instantly the seriousness with which justice was enforced. Even those moving past the site days later could sense the weight of the ritual. It lingered in the atmosphere, in the stillness of the wood, in the quiet hum of a place where many had witnessed the thin divide between life and silence. The axe retained a presence long after the event ended. Some executioners kept their blades wrapped in cloth, stored with a reverence born not of pride, but of understanding. They knew that their role shaped the community's perception of order and justice. Though their faces were not always remembered, the motion of the blade and the finality of the act endured in memory. These rituals were not mere actions. They were reflections of medieval social structure, a system that required visible consequence to maintain cohesion in a world where written law reached only a few. Over time, the scaffold and the axe became symbols embedded in medieval consciousness. They represented not only punishment, but the power of authority, the structure of community, and the fragile divide between rule and chaos. The image of a raised platform in a crowded square, the presence of a sharpened blade, and the quiet that followed the final blow, formed a tableau that defined the era. The scaffold stood as an emblem of justice delivered swiftly, witnessed openly, and remembered deeply by those who lived within its shadow. The pillory stood at the heart of many medieval towns, a wooden structure raised not for death, but for prolonged humiliation. It relied on exposure rather than injury, turning the rhythms of daily life into instruments of judgment. Situated near markets, crossroads, or the fronts of public buildings, it was placed where people naturally gathered. Its presence shaped how communities understood punishment, for it made the condemned visible, immobile, and entirely subject to the passing crowd. Unlike the scaffold or the stake, the pillory did not mark an end. Instead, it stretched a moment of disgrace into hours or days, allowing it to settle deeply into memory. The structure itself consisted of 2 wooden boards hinged together, each carved with 3 openings, 2 for the arms and 1 for the head. When closed, the boards fixed the condemned into a bowing posture, neither upright nor kneeling. This posture communicated vulnerability, a physical representation of guilt, enforced whether the accused admitted wrongdoing or not. The pillory's design ensured that those placed in it faced forward, unable to turn away from those who came to watch. In this way, punishment became not only a matter of restraint, but of forced confrontation. Crowds formed quickly when someone was secured in the pillory. Market vendors, laborers, children, and travelers stopped to look. The condemned became part of the day's activity, visible between transactions, conversations, and the constant motion of the town. The crowd's reaction varied. Some treated the moment with seriousness, offering quiet judgment. Others turned it into spectacle, speaking loudly about the offense or shouting comments meant to deepen the shame. The pillory depended upon this engagement. Without witnesses, the ritual lacked purpose. The crowd's presence transformed a simple wooden frame into a stage where social norms were reinforced. Time moved differently for the person locked within the boards. The weight of the wood pressed on shoulders and wrists, creating slow, persistent strain. Muscles stiffened, joints ached. The inability to shift position turned discomfort into endurance. Those who had stood in the pillory spoke of the minutes stretching into extended hours, the noises of the marketplace amplifying their sense of isolation, even while surrounded by people. Punishment in the pillory relied on this combination of physical restriction and emotional exposure, a method designed not to cause injury, but to break pride and disrupt reputation. Some towns allowed people to bring small objects, vegetables, mud, or clumps of dirt to throw at the condemned. These acts were not required, but often encouraged indirectly through long-standing custom. The materials were rarely dangerous, but added layers of humiliation. Each impact served as a reminder of community disapproval. Those who watched understood the message. Behavior deemed harmful or disruptive would be answered with public shame. Even mild offenses could lead to days in the pillory, making the structure a constant presence in medieval life. a visual symbol of boundaries that could not be crossed without consequence. Weather played its own role. A person locked in the pillory had no shelter from sun, rain, or wind. Exposure added to the discomfort, making the ritual unpredictable. A bright day drew larger crowds. A storm amplified the difficulty of standing immobilized. The condemned had no choice but to endure the elements. Some who passed by offered water or shade, small gestures of compassion that coexisted with the surrounding judgment. Medieval society did not forbid kindness, but it framed such actions carefully, understanding them as personal decisions rather than challenges to the punishment itself. The duration of time spent in the pillory varied based on local custom and the severity of the offense. Some stood for a portion of a day, others returned repeatedly over several days. The repetition deepened the effect, imprinting the memory of the punishment not only on the condemned, but on the entire community. Each appearance reinforced the reminder of past wrongs and the expectation to avoid future misconduct. In this way, the pillory served as both corrective measure and deterrent, shaping behavior through repetition and visibility. Nightfall sometimes brought an end to the punishment, though in certain towns the condemned remained until morning. The shifting shadows and dimming marketplace changed the atmosphere significantly. As the crowd thinned, the silence became heavier. Those left alone in the pillory felt the isolation more acutely, the darkness expanding the sense of vulnerability. The creak of wood, the distant sound of footsteps, and the slow cooling of the air created an experience different from the daytime ritual. Medieval records describe individuals who spoke of the night as the most difficult part of the punishment, not because of increased discomfort, but because of the weight of unbroken stillness. When the boards were finally lifted and the person released, the body moved stiffly, adjusting slowly to regained freedom. But the impact of the pillory extended far beyond that moment. The true wound was not physical, but social. People remembered faces, posture, expressions, and whispered conversations that had surrounded the ritual. Reputation in medieval towns held significant power, influencing trade, marriage prospects, and status within guilds. The pillory, therefore, was not simply a method of punishment, but a mechanism that shaped how society remembered an individual long after the punishment ended. The empty pillory continued to stand in the square, a constant reminder that judgment could be swift and public. Each time someone walked past, they recognized its form, recalling the last person who had stood trapped within its boards. It served as a quiet boundary marker for behavior, a reinforcement of communal expectations without requiring active enforcement. Even when unused, its presence shaped the rhythm of daily life. The pillory embodied the medieval belief that punishment must be visible to be effective. By exposing the condemned to the gaze of neighbors and strangers, it turned a single offense into a public dialogue. The event invited reflection, gossip, warnings, and retellings that extended beyond the moment itself. The wooden boards held more than the weight of human limbs. They carried the weight of communal memory, shaping how people understood shame, consequence, and the fragile relationship between individual behavior and collective order. The stocks appeared in nearly every medieval settlement, from small rural villages to busy market towns. Positioned at ground level rather than raised like the pillory, they restrained a person by locking the ankles between two heavy wooden boards. The simplicity of their design made them both accessible and enduring. A long bench or platform often accompanied the structure, though many versions sat directly on the ground, forcing the condemned into an uncomfortable seated or crouched position. The punishment delivered by the stocks was not rapid or dramatic. Instead, it unfolded through slow discomfort, exposure, and the steady passage of time. Medieval communities placed the stocks in central or frequently traveled areas. Their presence blended into daily life, becoming part of the landscape of order that governed each town. Children passing by on errands, merchants pushing carts, and travelers entering through village gates all recognized the meaning of someone confined in this wooden frame. The stocks did not demand immediate attention, yet they influenced the atmosphere of any space in which they stood. Their low height allowed anyone to approach, whether out of curiosity, sympathy, or disapproval. Once secured, A person in the stocks found movement nearly impossible. The wooden boards clamped tightly around the ankles, spreading discomfort from the feet upward. Muscles stiffened. Circulation slowed. Even slight shifts in posture required considerable effort, and relief rarely came. The posture itself, often seated or forced into a curved position, communicated a form of vulnerability distinct from other punishments. The condemned became immobile at the level of those who passed by, accessible in a way that made the punishment feel personal to onlookers. Time was the primary tool of the stocks. Hours stretched with deliberate slowness. People living in medieval towns kept time through bells, sunlight, and routine. But for someone confined, these markers lost meaning. The passing of a merchant's cart or the ringing of a church bell only emphasized the stillness imposed upon the body. The discomfort deepened not through sudden pain, but through the gradual weight of immobility. Joints stiffened, feet swelled, the wooden boards pressed into the skin, creating sharp reminders of the punishment's purpose. Crowds gathered intermittently, depending on the time of day. Market activity created natural waves of people, with some stopping briefly to observe or comment. Unlike more severe punishments, the stocks did not require a large audience. Their effectiveness lay in integration with ordinary life. People would see the condemned while buying bread, delivering goods, or tending livestock. Punishment, in this form, became woven into the movements of the community rather than isolated as a specific event. Some used the opportunity to speak to those confined, whether to offer encouragement or to express disapproval. Words spoken at close range carried weight, revealing the community's perception of the offense. Medieval justice relied not only on the punishment itself, but on shared acknowledgement. The slow exposure of the stocks encouraged reflection among those who walked by. They saw the posture, the restraint, and the discomfort, and understood the reminder it served. The cost of breaking rules extended far beyond a single moment. Weather influenced the experience profoundly. Rain pooled around the ankles, wind chilled the legs, mud splashed onto clothing. In summer, heat intensified the sensation of stiffness, turning hours into exercises of endurance. Those confined had no control over the elements, and the stocks offered no shelter. The unpredictability of weather meant that each punishment unfolded differently. A clear morning could turn into sudden rain, while a cold day could become unbearable with afternoon winds. The community understood that nature itself played a role in testing the endurance of those restrained. Food and water were not always offered promptly. The responsibility varied by region and by the severity of the offense. Some towns allowed friends or family members to bring small portions, while others left the condemned entirely dependent on officials. Hunger and thirst added to the discomfort, though rarely to the point of danger. The purpose of the stocks was not death but humility, and deprivation was kept within controlled limits. The psychological weight, however, rested on the realization that the condemned had little agency and depended on others for even the smallest comforts. As day turned to evening, the character of the stocks changed. Shadows lengthened across the ground. The noise of the marketplace faded. Those who remained confined after sunset felt the deepening stillness more acutely. Visibility decreased, and the sense of isolation grew. Footsteps became rarer. Conversations quieted. The environment shifted from communal observation to quiet endurance. Medieval records note that night confinement often intensified the psychological strain, as the lack of distraction heightened awareness of every physical discomfort. Release from the stocks required officials or guards to unfasten the wooden boards, lifting the weight from the ankles. Even this moment brought its own form of difficulty. Legs often felt weak or numb, and standing required time and assistance. The first steps after confinement revealed the full effect of the punishment, as stiffness and soreness lingered long after the boards had been removed. Those who walked away carried their discomfort with them, a reminder that the stocks shaped not only the hours spent in restraint, but the hours that followed. The aftermath extended beyond physical strain. Reputation mattered deeply in medieval life, and having been placed in the stocks meant facing a community that had witnessed or at least become aware of the punishment. Some individuals found reintegration challenging, especially in small villages where everyone knew one another. Others resumed daily activities with little difficulty, depending on the nature of the offense and the relationships they maintained prior to punishment. The stocks created visible consequences, but the social impact varied widely. Even when empty, the stocks remained a symbol of authority. Their presence communicated boundaries without requiring active enforcement. People passing by saw the structure and understood the rules it represented. The wooden boards, weathered with age, darkened by rain, sun, and repeated use, though simple in construction, they carried the weight of communal expectation. The stocks stood not as monuments to cruelty, but as tools of a society that relied on visibility, endurance, and restraint to maintain order. The slow, grounded nature of the stocks distinguished them from other medieval punishments. They did not rely on spectacle, pain, or death. Instead, they emphasized the quiet discomfort of sitting exposed to the community and the environment. Through this method, medieval towns reinforced the idea that actions carried consequences that could unfold gradually, shaping both body and reputation. The stocks served as a reminder that justice could be felt not only through moments of dramatic display, but through the steady, unyielding presence of restraint, woven into the fabric of everyday life. The whipping post stood as one of the most familiar structures in medieval communities, recognized for its upright beam and the ring of worn earth around its base. It required no elaborate construction, no platform, and no specialized equipment beyond the instruments held by the official assigned to carry out the punishment. Yet despite its simplicity, the whipping post carried deep symbolic weight. It represented immediate correction, visible consequence, and the raw presence of authority in its most physical form. Unlike punishments meant to shame or restrain, whipping relied on direct bodily impact, turning the human form into the central site of judgment. The ritual began long before the first strike. Those assigned to carry out the punishment maintained a steady, measured pace as they approached the post, ensuring that every movement remained deliberate. The condemned, escorted by guards or community officials, walked through familiar streets that now felt altered by the knowledge of what waited ahead. The whipping post transformed even the most ordinary spaces. A quiet stretch of ground near a market stall, a corner beside a storage building, or an area set aside near the entrance of a town could shift into a site of controlled violence. The environment shaped the experience, reminding observers that punishment existed not apart from the community, but woven into its daily rhythms. When the condemned reached the post, their hands were secured behind or above them, depending on regional custom. Ropes or leather straps ensured that movement remained limited. The position forced the body into stillness, exposing the back or shoulders to the strikes that followed. The physical restraint communicated the finality of the moment. Struggle served no purpose. The ritual demanded submission both in posture and in spirit, and the structure of the post enforced this expectation without words. Crowds gathered as they always did for visible punishment, though the size varied. Some came out of duty, others out of curiosity, and many arrived simply because the whipping post stood in a place where people naturally passed by. The sound of a nearby marketplace, the clatter of tools, or the steady movement of carts continued around the scene, blending ordinary life with extraordinary consequence. Medieval towns did not separate punishment from daily activity. The whipping post reminded everyone that order existed only through continued enforcement. The official delivering the blows carried out the task with practiced control. The instrument, whether a leather whip, knotted cord, or switch of bundled branches, was chosen for its ability to deliver pain without immediate risk of crippling injury. The number of strikes was predetermined by local custom or the decision of a magistrate. Each strike followed a steady pace, neither rushed nor paused unnecessarily. The rhythm created its own form of ritual, drawing attention to the predictability and structure of the punishment. The sound of each impact carried across the open space, marking the passage of the ritual stroke by stroke. Pain served as the primary means of correction, but the posture and exposure deepened the effect. The condemned felt not only the physical sting but the awareness of being watched. Eyes observed every reaction, the tightening of muscles, the slow controlled breath, the involuntary flinch. Medieval communities understood that punishment communicated more than the suffering itself. It broadcast expectation, reinforced boundaries, and created a shared understanding of what actions carried consequences. The pain marked the individual, the visibility marked the community. Environmental conditions influenced every aspect of the experience. Heat amplified discomfort, making sweat cling to the skin beneath the force of each strike. Cold stiffened muscles, turning the body rigid and heightening the sensation. Wind carried the sound farther, drawing distant onlookers who recognized the meaning immediately. Rain turned the ground to mud, mixing earth with the ritual and softening the space beneath restrained feet. The whipping post did not adapt to weather. Those undergoing punishment did. Medieval beliefs often interpreted harsh conditions as symbolic reinforcement of guilt or divine reminder. The crowd's behavior shaped the emotional atmosphere. Some watched quietly. Others muttered remarks meant to reinforce the perceived legitimacy of the ritual. A few looked away during the harshest strikes, their silence indicating discomfort rather than objection. Medieval justice did not require the loud approval of onlookers. It required their presence. A witnessed punishment carried memory, and memory shaped behavior far more effectively than private reprimand. The whipping post relied on this shared experience. When the final strike fell, the ritual did not end immediately. A moment of stillness followed, where breath, posture, and silence gathered before movement resumed. Officials stepped forward to release the ropes or straps, their gestures steady and efficient. The condemned, now free, moved slowly at first. Muscles trembled. Skin bore the marks of the ritual, raised lines or spreading welts arranged in patterns that reflected the rhythm of the punishment. Clothing was returned or adjusted. Water might be offered, not as compassion alone, but as part of the formal closure of the event. The walk away from the whipping post carried its own weight. Steps felt heavy. The presence of onlookers shaped the atmosphere, creating a mixture of embarrassment, relief, and resignation. Some individuals chose paths away from crowded spaces. Others re-entered the marketplace directly, merging into the daily flow of life, with visible reminders of what had occurred. The punishment shaped not only the body, but the days that followed, influencing how others approached, greeted, or avoided the condemned. The post itself remained unchanged. After each ritual, it stood in the same position, weathering sunlight, rain, and the passage of people who walked past it without a second thought. Yet its meaning lingered beneath the surface of ordinary life. Even when unoccupied, the whipping post communicated a promise. That order would continue to be enforced, that consequence followed wrongdoing, and that the community upheld its rules through rituals carried out in public view. Over time, the simplicity of the whipping post ensured its continued use. It required minimal resources, demanded only a small number of participants, and conveyed a powerful message. It did not rely on elaborate structures or prolonged rituals. Its effectiveness came from the sharp clarity of its purpose. A person restrained, a series of blows delivered, a reminder etched into memory. Medieval towns depended on such methods to maintain cohesion in a world shaped by custom rather than uniform law. The ritual of whipping reflected a belief central to medieval justice, that pain, when witnessed publicly, corrected not only the offender, but the community observing. The whipping post stood as a permanent marker of this belief, its presence shaping behavior through the quiet authority of its upright frame. No matter how often it was used or how long it remained untouched, its meaning endured, an expression of order carved into the heart of medieval life. The stock stood at the edge of many medieval towns, positioned in places where people tended to pass throughout the day. They were made of wooden frames with openings for the ankles, and in some regions, additional sections held the wrists. The structure appeared simple, yet it created a situation that few who experienced it could forget. Unlike punishments that ended within minutes, the stocks relied on time. Hours unfolded at a slow, steady pace, and the person confined within them had no means of escape until officials declared the period complete. This extended exposure formed the core of the punishment, shaping both the physical and mental experience. The ritual began when the condemned was brought to the structure. The placement of the stocks ensured that people would witness the scene naturally as they went about their routine. Officials guided the individual forward, opened the wooden boards, and secured the ankles with a firm, deliberate movement. If wrists were also included, the upper frame was lowered to lock them in place. The clicking sound of wood meeting wood marked the start of the confinement. Once secured, the condemned became part of the landscape, unable to turn away, shield their face, or change posture. Time passed slowly in the stocks. The inability to shift weight caused discomfort to build in stages. At first, the posture felt unfamiliar but tolerable. As minutes extended into hours, muscles tightened, legs cramped, and the pressure on joints intensified. The body adjusted only within the narrow limits allowed by the structure. The environment played a significant role, as heat, wind, or cold shaped the experience. Sunlight warmed the wood, making contact surfaces increasingly uncomfortable. Wind chilled exposed skin. Rain created streams of water that flowed beneath the confined individual, soaking clothing and settling into the grain of the timber. The presence of the community added another dimension. The purpose of the stocks was not physical harm alone, but public exposure. People walking past observed the individual not as a member of the crowd, but as an example placed before them. Some glanced briefly before continuing on their way. Others paused, forming small clusters that commented quietly. Reactions varied depending on the nature of the offense. Some individuals regarded the situation with indifference. Others expressed disapproval through murmured remarks or gestures. The condemned remained within earshot of every comment, unable to look away or respond freely. Silence became a companion, broken only by occasional shifts of the wood or the steady movement of people nearby. Those confined in the stocks also confronted the slow progression of daylight. Morning brightness gave way to afternoon warmth, followed by the softening of evening light. Each shift reminded the individual of time slipping past at a pace dictated by the punishment. Shadows lengthened, stretching across the ground in patterns that changed with the position of the sun. Birds passed overhead. Market stalls opened and closed. The world continued, and the stocks stood unmoving through every hour. The discomfort expanded beyond the physical strain of immobility. Exposure left the condemned open to the elements, insects, and the steady gaze of strangers. Flies landed on skin. Dust settled in clothing. The air carried smells from nearby streets or markets, some sharp and others muted. The body experienced fatigue not through exertion, but through forced stillness. Hunger and thirst intensified the experience when the confinement stretched into longer durations. Medieval communities considered this part of the natural consequences rather than an added punishment. Guards or officials occasionally checked on the individual, not to provide comfort, but to ensure the conditions remained as intended. These brief interactions remained limited, often consisting of a glance or a reminder of how much time remained. Their presence reinforced the structure of authority behind the ritual. The stocks did not rely on continuous supervision. The community itself contributed to the enforcement by acknowledging and accepting the sight of the condemned in place. The emotional toll varied. Some individuals retreated inward, focusing on breath and the steady rhythm of passing moments. Others struggled to remain composed, especially when exposed to long stretches of silence. The inability to control one's environment or posture created a sense of vulnerability that deepened as the hours continued. The structure forced stillness while the mind remained active, producing a slow internal cycle of reflection, frustration, and endurance. Children passed by with curiosity, pulled along by adults who regarded the scene as ordinary. Dogs wandered close enough to sniff the ground. Vendors pushing carts made wide arcs around the structure. The stocks shaped movement within the town, subtly adjusting paths without altering routines. This integration into daily life gave the punishment an understated but persistent authority. When the assigned period concluded, officials returned to release the wooden boards. The lifting of the frame brought relief mixed with lingering stiffness. Blood flow returned to limbs with a sensation that bordered between discomfort and relief. Standing upright again felt unfamiliar at first. The shift from confinement to freedom occurred quietly, without ceremony. Yet it marked a significant change for the individual who had endured the long hour. Walking away from the stocks required effort. Legs felt weak. Balance needed a moment to return. The presence of onlookers added weight to the first steps. Some people watched the release with mild interest before returning to their tasks. Others remained unaware that the ritual had ended. The condemned moved through the same streets that earlier carried them toward the structure, now transformed by the memory of what had taken place. The stocks remained behind, ready for the next person assigned to them. Weathered wood absorbed the marks of countless imprisonments, darkening in places where hands once rested or ankles pressed against its surface. The structure endured season after season, resisting decay through repairs and maintenance. Its continued presence reminded the community of the system of order that governed daily life. Even when unoccupied, the stocks retained significance as a silent witness to the consequences of transgression. The use of the stocks reflected a belief central to medieval justice, that exposure, stillness, and time could shape behavior as effectively as any physical blow. The simplicity of the structure concealed a complex experience that unfolded slowly, hour by hour, shaping body and mind. Medieval communities valued this method not for spectacle, but for its steady clarity. The stocks offered no dramatic moments, only the quiet weight of passing time and the enduring authority of public judgment. The pillory stood taller than the stocks, built to hold a person upright by securing the head and hands within a wooden frame. Its purpose resembled that of the stocks, yet it carried a different posture and a different kind of strain. Where the stocks forced a seated or crouched position, the pillory required the condemned to stand exposed, shoulders tightening beneath the weight of the upper board. This structure often occupied central spaces in towns near markets, churches, or crossroads, ensuring a natural flow of witnesses throughout the day. The process began with officials guiding the condemned to the wooden platform. The pillory's upper board lifted with a sound that varied depending on weather and age. Swollen wood in winter made it heavy and creaking, while dry summer boards moved with a sharper tone. Once the head and hands aligned with the openings, the board lowered slowly, locking the individual into an upright position. The closure sounded final, marking the start of the confinement. The posture created immediate tension in the shoulders and neck, and over time, the discomfort deepened into a steady, unrelenting pressure. Movement became restricted to slight shifts of weight from one foot to the other. Even these adjustments offered only momentary relief. The muscles in the back and legs reacted to the rigid stance, and the wrists felt the edges of the openings where skin pressed against the wood. Breathing remained possible, but the downward pull of the board encouraged stillness. The eyes faced forward, unable to turn fully. This position made the pillory a focal point for anyone passing by, placing the condemned at the center of the public's attention. The surrounding environment shaped the experience. Heat reached the wooden frame, warming it through the day and increasing physical strain. Cold made the wood contract, pressing harder against exposed skin. Rain soaked clothing and dripped into the openings, while wind chilled the face and hands. Insects found their way towards still bodies. Dust and smoke from nearby activity settled on the boards. The individual felt each shift of weather more intensely, because escape from the elements was impossible. The pillory encouraged public observation. As people moved through the square or along the street, they noticed the upright figure enclosed by the frame. Some continued walking with only a brief glance. Others slowed, forming small groups that watched quietly. The comments they exchanged varied in tone. Some reflected disapproval or curiosity. Others remained neutral, spoken simply as remarks on a sight that had become part of the day's rhythm. The condemned heard every word, unable to step back or hide. Children approached with wide eyes, studying the structure as if trying to understand how it worked. Adults guided them forward or pulled them away depending on personal views. Merchants continued their activities, sometimes setting up stalls near enough that the sounds of commerce reached the condemned, clearly voices calling out prices, metal clinking, cloth being folded, or carts rolling over uneven ground. The contrast between daily life and enforced stillness created a sensation of separation from the familiar world. As hours passed, fatigue settled into the body. Legs trembled slightly from maintaining balance. Shoulders tightened under the weight of the wooden frame. Hands swelled as blood flow slowed in their confined position. The contrast between movement around the pillory and the immobility of the condemned became more pronounced. People carrying baskets, tools, or goods walked freely past the fixed figure. Animals wandered close enough to sniff the ground or investigate the platform. The sounds of conversations drifted through the air, rising and falling with the pace of the day. The emotional experience shifted with time. At first, the individual might focus on posture, discomfort, or the passing of people. Gradually, the mind turned inward. Thoughts followed slow patterns, shaped by confinement and the steady rhythm of the surroundings. The quiet moments between groups of passers-by felt long, interrupted only by the occasional gust of wind or the sound of footsteps approaching. The isolation within a crowd created a unique tension, a sense of being seen constantly yet disconnected from everyone. Officials returned at intervals, checking the stability of the structure and the condition of the condemned. These visits remained brief, often consisting of a visual inspection or a simple reminder of how much longer the confinement would last. Their presence reaffirmed the authority behind the ritual. The pillory did not require continuous supervision. The public served as the silent audience, and the wooden frame maintained order through its rigid design. As daylight shifted, the scene transformed. Morning brightness softened into afternoon light that cast longer shadows across the square. Evening approached, bringing cooler air. Lamps or torches lit nearby areas, flickering against the wooden surfaces of the structure. The condemned's eyes adjusted to each change, experiencing the surroundings as a sequence of slow transitions. The passage of time felt both deliberate and unyielding. When the period of confinement ended, officials lifted the upper board once more. Relief arrived gradually, as the body adjusted from stillness to movement. The individual stepped back, feeling weight return to limbs that had carried tension for hours. The arms lowered with difficulty. Blood flow returned with a sharp sensation. The head regained full range of motion. Walking away from the platform required care, as balance took a moment to settle. The pillory remained behind after each release, silent, rigid, and ready for future use. Its presence represented a form of order that emphasized exposure and endurance rather than sudden impact. Medieval communities valued the clarity of this method. The structure stood through seasons marked by weather and repeated use, and served as a reminder of the expectations placed upon the community. Even in moments when it stood empty, the pillory carried meaning. People walked past it knowing its purpose. Its simple design concealed the complex experience of those who had stood within it. The upright posture, the weight of the board, the public gaze, and the slow passing of time shaped a form of punishment that did not rely on force but on the unchanging presence of the wooden frame. The cucking stool stood near the edges of rivers, ponds, or shallow inlets, built from wood that darkened over time from repeated exposure to water. Its structure resembled a simple chair fixed to a long beam, balanced in such a way that it could be lowered into or raised out of the water with controlled movement. This device served as a method of public discipline, emphasizing exposure, immersion, and the slow passage of time rather than immediate physical force. Preparation began with the stool positioned on dry ground. Officials approached with measured steps, guiding the individual toward the chair. The seat, though plain, carried faint grooves where previous occupants had shifted or struggled to maintain balance. The beam extended outward like the handle of a large tool, resting on a pivot built into a wooden frame. This construction allowed a small group of people to maneuver the beam with steady pressure. Once the individual sat, attendants secured simple restraints around the wrists or placed a wooden bar across the lap to prevent movement. The stool remained upright for a short moment, allowing those gathered to observe the posture and expression of the seated figure. Clothing clung loosely, soon to be weighed down by water. The chair's legs hovered above the surface, creating a brief pause before the first descent. The movement downward began slowly. The beam shifted with a creaking sound as those holding it applied steady force. The stool dipped toward the water, and the individual leaned back as the angle changed. The surface tension broke with a quiet splash that expanded outward in circles. The water rose around the legs, waist, and chest, each level adding a new sensation of cold and heaviness. When fully submerged, the stool rested just below the surface, long enough for the ripples to settle. The ascent came next. With controlled motion, the attendants lifted the beam, raising the stool back into the air. Water poured from sleeves, hair, and fabric, dripping steadily into the pond below. The air felt colder after immersion, and the weight of soaked clothing added resistance to every shift of the body. People standing along the bank watched the transition with quiet attention, observing each detail without the need for comment. After a brief interval, the descent resumed. The cycle repeated with almost mechanical precision. Each immersion lasted only as long as necessary for the attendants to maintain a steady rhythm. The water's temperature determined the nature of the experience. In warmer seasons, the sensation remained shocking but bearable. In colder months, the chill intensified, reaching deep into the limbs and creating an ache that lingered long after the stool rose again. The surroundings contributed to the atmosphere. Birds circled above the water, their calls echoing across the surface. Reeds shifted in the breeze along the shoreline. People gathered in groups, some standing, others sitting on nearby stones or fallen logs. Their expressions varied, though the tone remained restrained. The sound of moving water blended with murmurs of conversation, forming a muted backdrop to the methodical lowering and lifting of the beam. As the repetitions continued, the individual's breathing changed. The first few immersions often led to gasps upon resurfacing, but later ones produced slower, more controlled breaths. Vision blurred slightly as droplets streamed from the eyelashes. Hands tightened around the edges of the chair or rested motionless under the restraints. The senses alternated between muffled underwater quiet and the cooling rush of open air. Officials overseeing the process watched with practiced calm. They signaled when to lower, when to pause, and when to end the sequence. Their role focused on maintaining consistency, ensuring that the rhythm remained steady and that the stool returned to its highest point at the appropriate moment. The device required coordination and patience rather than force. When the final lift reached its peak, the stool remained suspended long enough for water to drain from the frame. Attendants then unfastened the restraints and helped the individual down from the chair. Clothes clung tightly to the body, heavy with absorbed water. The ground felt uneven beneath unsteady feet, and the contrast between water temperature and open air created a physical tension that lingered with each step away from the stool. The cucking stool stayed near the water after each use, positioned so that passers-by could see its simple construction even when it remained still. Its presence served as a reminder of communal expectations and the authority that shaped daily life. Over time, the wood absorbed the effects of weather and repeated immersions, becoming textured with marks of use. Even when untouched, the stool retained an air of anticipation. People crossing the nearby path glanced at it briefly before continuing their day. Children pointed toward the long beam and asked quiet questions. Travelers paused to observe the structure before moving on. The setting around the stool shifted with the seasons, yet the chair itself stayed constant, reflecting a form of discipline that relied on rhythm, exposure, and the natural elements. Although simple in design, the experience it created remained complex. The cycle of immersion and emergence shaped a confrontation between stillness and movement, water and air, tension and release. The cucking stool did not depend on spectacle. Instead, its effect came from repetition, environment, and the unchanging presence of the structure poised above the water. The pillory stood at the center of many town squares, shaped from thick beams of wood fitted with carved openings for the head and hands. Its height varied depending on local customs, but most were raised just enough to force the individual into an uncomfortable tilt, neither fully bent nor fully upright. Even from a distance, its design drew attention, a static frame intended to hold a single person, while the world around them continued in steady motion. The process began with the removal of the upper beam, lifted slowly by attendants who had performed the task countless times. The hinges creaked in familiar arcs, marking the start of the restraint. The lower beam held the carved half circles, worn smooth from repeated use. Once the opening revealed itself, the individual guided their neck and wrists forward, or was gently steered into place by officials. When the upper beam lowered, The sound of wood meeting wood echoed through the square with a dull finality. Standing in the pillory created an unusual awareness of posture. The neck bent forward at a fixed angle, while the hands protruded outward through the holes, leaving the shoulders tense and slightly raised. Breathing remained possible, yet the position encouraged shallow inhales. The weight of the body shifted unevenly between the legs and the upper torso, creating a strain that grew more noticeable with each passing minute. The square around the pillory moved at its usual pace. Market vendors arranged baskets of produce in rows that formed soft lines across the ground. Children ran in uneven paths between errands. The sound of wooden wheels rolling over cobblestones punctuated the space. Wind slipped between buildings, brushing dust along the street in thin spirals. In this setting, the restrained figure became a still point among constant movement. Time passed with little variation. The individual leaned slightly forward because of the beam's height, causing muscles in the back and legs to tighten. Fingers curled instinctively over the edges of the openings, seeking support that the structure did not provide. The sun cast shifting shadows across the pillory, warming the wood and altering the temperature of the exposed skin. In cloudy conditions, the air pressed cooler against the face, arms, and hands. During quieter hours, few people approached. Those who walked nearby kept their steps steady, glancing only briefly. The restrained figure heard the soft rhythm of footsteps passing behind or beside the frame. At other times, when activity increased, the environment changed. Conversations formed indistinct layers of sound that blended with the rustle of cloth, the clatter of tools, and the occasional laughter drifting from different corners of the square. The discomfort of the pillory did not rely on movement, but on the absence of it. The fixed position required the individual to adapt to a posture that resisted relaxation. Muscles shifted from minor tension to deeper ache, as weight shifted from one leg to the other. Every attempt to adjust brought only minimal relief. The neck remained locked, the wrists unable to rotate fully, the shoulders stiff from imbalance. Moisture added to the experience. Rain collected on the top beam and dripped down in a slow, uneven pattern. Droplets gathered at the edge of the wood and fell onto the exposed arms and back. Wind increased the chill, and clothing absorbed water until it clung tightly to the body. In summer, sun exposure created a different discomfort. Heat gathered along the neck and shoulders, and sweat formed steadily along the face, tracing lines down to the ground. The method's effect deepened with the passing of hours. Focus drifted between physical sensations and the ambient activity of the square. The individual listened to overlapping voices, carts moving at a measured pace, merchants calling out prices, and animals passing through the market path. These sounds formed a continuous backdrop that emphasized stillness in contrast to movement everywhere else. Occasionally, someone approached more closely. They paused for a brief moment, observing the posture and the fixed beams. Some spoke a comment or asked a question without expecting an answer. Others stood silently, studying the structure and the restrained figure before stepping away. These brief interactions added weight to the atmosphere, not through confrontation, but through observation. As the hours continued, fatigue became one of the most significant elements of the experience. Legs trembled from extended standing. Arms grew numb, then prickled as sensation returned when weight shifted slightly. The fixed angle of the neck encouraged stiffness at the base of the spine. Breathing remained steady but shallow, shaped by the position of the ribs and shoulders. Eventually, attendants returned to complete the process. They lifted the upper beam once more, using deliberate, practiced movements. As the restraint opened, the individual stepped back slowly, allowing circulation to return fully to the arms and shoulders. The body adjusted to normal posture again, though lingering tension persisted. With the removal of the beam, the pillory returned to its passive state, still and silent until its next use. Even when unoccupied, the structure held a presence within the square. People walking by recognized its purpose immediately. Its beams, worn smooth by years of weather and use, reflected the continuity of a method that relied on immobilization, time, and exposure, rather than noise or sudden action. Positioned in a public space, the pillory served as a reminder of order and the quiet endurance demanded by restraint. Though simple in construction, the experience it created unfolded slowly. shaped by posture, duration, and environment. The square's daily movements framed the stillness at its center, and the unchanging form of the pillory influenced the rhythm of those who passed near it. Through its silence and its structure, it imposed a weight that extended beyond the physical frame. The coffin cage hung suspended from a sturdy wooden frame, shaped to resemble the narrow outline of a standing body. Its iron bars curved inward just enough to suggest enclosure rather than comfort, forming a rigid silhouette that allowed no room for movement. When empty, it swayed gently with each passing breeze, creating a faint metallic tap where the bars met their joints. To anyone approaching, it appeared less like an instrument and more like a fixed outline of stillness waiting to be occupied. The process began with the slow opening of the hinged front panel. The metal creaked as it swung outward, revealing a narrow interior barely wider than the frame itself. The height accommodated an average adult, yet it did not offer enough depth for the body to lean or shift. Once inside, the individual stood upright with their back aligned against the curved bars. The door closed with deliberate force, locking them into a position that defined the experience. Standing without rest, balanced without support, enclosed without the possibility of retreat. The cage allowed visibility in every direction. Through the slender gaps between the bars, the surroundings remained fully in view. The sky appeared above in open stretches, changing from light to darker tones as the day progressed. Below, the ground remained within sight, marked by dirt, scattered stones, or patches of grass depending on the location. Animals wandering nearby could be seen moving along their natural paths. People walking past maintained their pace, with only brief glances. The design of the cage ensured that nothing was hidden except the ability to move. Wind interacted with the enclosure in subtle ways. Each gust passed between the bars, brushing against the skin in uneven patterns. In colder seasons, the exposure caused a steady chill along the arms, legs, and face. In warmer weather, the air carried dust that collected along the metal surfaces. The cage swayed only slightly, enough to remind the occupant that the world around them remained in motion, even while they remained fixed in place. Time formed one of the most significant elements within the cage. Standing became its own task, influenced by the gradual fatigue that settled into the legs. The weight distributed evenly at first, then shifted as muscles adjusted to maintain balance. Knees trembled lightly, then steadily as hours passed. The position offered no opportunity to sit, lean, or bend. Even the smallest change required careful redistribution of weight without altering posture. Breathing stayed consistent, yet the strain across the ribs and spine grew more noticeable as the day unfolded. Sound carried through the open structure. Footsteps formed a recurring pattern along nearby paths. Conversations layered together in a distant hum, punctuated by sharper echoes when objects struck stone or wood. Birds settled briefly on the upper beam, their wings creating small bursts of movement that contrasted with the stillness of the cage. Occasionally, cartwheels rolled by, leaving behind a fading rhythm that blended into the broader environment. During quiet periods, the surroundings reflected a different atmosphere. Wind rustled through nearby vegetation. Clouds passed overhead in slow formations, marking the movement of time by shifting shadows across the ground. The cage felt heavier in stillness than in activity, as the absence of human presence emphasized the isolation of the enclosed figure. Even the smallest creak of metal carried louder significance when no other sounds competed with it. The passage of time affected not only muscle endurance but perception. The environment outside the cage appeared in shifting layers of focus, near objects clear and steady, distant activity softened by the limitation of viewpoint. Hours lengthened without dramatic changes, and the experience took shape through repetition rather than sudden events. Breathing settled into a rhythm, though the weight on the legs increased steadily. Shoulders bore no physical load, yet tension gathered across them as posture remained fixed. Shifts in weather altered the experience significantly. Rain fell freely through the bars, collecting on clothing and skin, with no barrier to soften the temperature. Droplets slid along the metal frame, creating thin streams that traced downward until they met the ground. In sunlight, the iron warmed, radiating heat that increased the discomfort of standing for extended periods. In both conditions, the environment remained unfiltered, making exposure a central part of the method's effect. As day turned toward evening, shadows stretched across the enclosure. The lower light changed the visual field, dimming the outlines of surrounding buildings, trees, or pathways. Sounds softened as activity decreased. The cage swayed slightly in the cooler air, and the metal emitted faint clicks as it adjusted to temperature changes. The figure inside adapted continually, shifting weight from one foot to the other with caution, never fully relieving the tension. When attendants finally approached to end the restraint, their movements contrasted sharply with the stillness of the enclosure. They unlatched the front panel, allowing it to swing open once more. The individual stepped forward slowly, feeling the first full freedom of movement in hours. Legs trembled with relief as blood flow increased, and posture adjusted from enforced rigidity to natural alignment. The cage, now empty, returned to its dormant state, ready to sway again with the next wind. Even unoccupied, the structure retained a distinct presence. It stood as a reminder of the endurance required within its bars and the quiet rigidity that defined its purpose. Its shape mimicked the outline of a human body, yet it offered none of the comfort or support that such a form suggested. Instead, it served as a frame for stillness, a place where time, posture, and exposure combined into a singular experience shaped by restraint rather than force. Through its design and placement, the coffin cage functioned not through noise or motion, but through the demands of remaining upright, enclosed, and unable to alter one's position. It transformed the open air into a confined space, and turned the surrounding environment into a constant companion. In its silence, it imposed a form of endurance that lasted long after the enclosure opened once more. The iron collar rested atop a short wooden post, shaped into a rigid loop, large enough to encircle the neck, but small enough to hold it firmly in place. The metal, darkened by age and exposure, bore faint scratches from repeated use. When the collar was open, its hinge side revealed a smooth interior curve intended to fit the shape of the neck without crushing it. Once closed, it transformed from an object into a frame of fixed ring that allowed no backward or forward movement. Attendants approached with steady steps, guiding the individual toward the post. The collar hung at a height that required slight bending of the knees before placement. As the neck settled into the curve, the metal felt cool, its surface absorbing ambient temperature. When the attendants brought the upper half downward, the hinge clicked with practiced precision. A final securing of the latch produced a muted metallic snap, marking the transition from movement to stillness. The collar permitted limited turning of the head, but prevented lowering or raising it. The posture it created positioned the spine in a straight, upright line. Shoulders rested in a natural state at first, though tension gradually collected across them as time passed. The individual's hands remained free, yet their freedom offered little relief. The inability to shift the head or adjust posture shaped the experience more than any restrictions on the limbs. The surrounding area held its own rhythm of activity. Villagers moved across the open space in varied patterns, some passing quickly with baskets, others pausing briefly to observe before continuing on their way. The sounds formed a layered environment: distant conversation, the tapping of shoes against stone, the creak of wooden carts rolling at measured intervals. The restrained figure stood among these movements, part of the scene yet fixed at its center. Weather played a significant role in the hours spent within the collar. On cooler days, the metal drew warmth from the skin, creating a persistent chill that settled around the jaw and throat. On warmer days, heat gathered along the edge where neck met metal, causing a slow buildup of discomfort. Wind passed freely, brushing hair across the face and carrying dust that formed light patterns along the ground around the post. The immobility of the head extended the sense of time. Each passing moment felt longer as the body adapted to a posture that resisted natural adjustment. Eyes moved freely, yet the angle of the head controlled the field of vision. Looking downward required shifting focus rather than tilting the head. Looking upward demanded a similar effort. Over time, the muscles along the neck tightened, creating a subtle ache that grew steadily as hours progressed. People continued their routines nearby. Some paused to speak softly to one another, unaware of the restrained figure's attempts to keep still. Children passed in bursts of movement, weaving around adults with careless speed. Animals pulled carts or wandered close before drifting away again. Through the fixed position, the individual witnessed these activities in fragments, moments of movement framed by stillness. Rain altered the atmosphere considerably. Droplets gathered on the upper curve of the collar before rolling downward, tracing a path along the metal and onto the skin. The moisture cooled the surface, intensifying the sensation around the enclosed neck. In heavier rainfall, water collected in thin sheets along the face and shoulders, but the collar's hold remained unchanged. The discomfort came not from force, but from exposure combined with immobility. As hours unfolded, tension spread through the back and legs. Standing remained possible, but the posture required to align with the collar limited natural shifts of weight. The individual leaned subtly against the post, though the collar prevented full support. Hands occasionally tightened or loosened, providing momentary relief but no lasting comfort. The experience relied on limitation rather than pressure, shaping endurance through the inability to reposition. Even in stillness, the environment continued to evolve. Shadows lengthened as the sun moved across the sky, altering the temperature and softening the intensity of light. The sounds shifted as well. Morning activity quieted, afternoon bustle rose, and evening brought a gradual reduction in noise. The collar, unchanged in form, created a frame through which these transitions passed. When attendants eventually returned, their approach signaled the end of the restraint. They unfastened the latch with a firm but controlled motion. As the collar opened, the cool air touched the newly freed skin. The individual stepped back slowly, adjusting posture and rotating the head for the first time in hours. Muscles stretched with relief, though lingering stiffness remained along the neck and shoulders. The collar hung open once more, its curved shape ready for its next use. Although simple in construction, the iron collar's effect extended beyond its physical form. It limited movement without enclosing the body, relying on time and posture to create discomfort. In its silence and rigidity, it influenced both the restrained figure and the environment around it, shaping a moment defined not by sudden impact but by gradual endurance. Through this method, the stillness imposed by the collar contrasted with the constant activity of daily life. In that contrast, the weight of the restraint revealed itself not through force, but through the quiet demands of immobility beneath an open sky. The hanging manacles consisted of 2 iron cuffs suspended from a horizontal beam by short chains. Each cuff opened with a hinge and closed with a round clasp, designed to secure the wrists just above head height. When unoccupied, the manacles swayed slightly whenever wind passed through the space, tapping softly against one another with a rhythmic metallic sound. Their design appeared simple, but the position they enforced shaped the experience entirely. To begin the restraint, attendants guided the individual beneath the beam. The height of the chains required them to stand with arms raised, aligning wrists with the open cuffs. As each cuff closed, the click of the metal created a steady, deliberate tone. Once secured, the wrists hung just high enough to lift tension through the arms and shoulders without suspending the body entirely. Feet remained firmly on the ground, yet the posture demanded constant engagement of the upper body. The position held the arms at a fixed upward angle. The shoulders bore the first signs of strain as weight shifted toward them. The chest expanded more fully with each breath, shaped by the angle of the rib cage. The spine aligned in a straight, upright line, creating a posture that could not be adjusted without pulling against the cuffs. Hands rested above eye level, fingers curled or extended as needed for brief relief, though the elevation offered no lasting comfort. The environment surrounding the restraint formed a backdrop of movement. Sounds drifted in from various directions, people walking along nearby paths, tools striking wood in slow, steady rhythms, animals passing with muted steps. The restrained figure stood beneath the beam as these sounds blended into a continuous atmosphere. Clothing rustled with each shift of weight, the fabric brushing against skin with a faint whisper. Wind played through the raised posture in noticeable ways. It cooled the arms more quickly than the rest of the body, brushing along exposed skin and passing through folds of fabric. In colder seasons, numbness formed gradually along the forearms. In warmer weather, sweat gathered at the temples and ran downward, tracing lines along the cheeks and dripping from the jaw. The elevated arms changed the way moisture moved, emphasizing the downward pull of both gravity and fatigue. Time acted slowly but consistently on the body. The first minutes passed without significant discomfort, but as hours unfolded, strain developed in clear stages. The shoulders tightened, then ached. The muscles along the upper arms grew tired, and the elbows bent involuntarily before straightening again to relieve tension. Each adjustment shifted pressure between the wrists and the joints. The ankles and legs remained functional, but supported the posture in ways that emphasized imbalance. During quieter periods, the surroundings seemed more noticeable. The restrained figure watched dust rise and fall as wind carried it across the ground. Shadows shifted as clouds passed overhead. Leaves on nearby structures rustled softly, creating a gentle rhythm that contrasted sharply with the stillness beneath the beam. Small details became clearer as the position restricted movement, tiny marks in the wood, irregularities in the metal, and faint imperfections on the ground below. As midday approached, the angle of light changed. Sunlight illuminated the manacles and cast thin shadows across the beam. When clouds formed overhead, the temperature shifted, cooling the metal and creating a subtle chill that traveled from the wrists down the arms. The environment shaped the experience without altering the restraint itself. The manacles remained fixed, yet the surrounding world changed in ways that reinforced the sense of enduring time. Footsteps occasionally approached nearby. People passed with measured pace, pausing long enough to glance at the raised posture before continuing. Some walked in silence, while others spoke softly to companions. Their presence added a layer of awareness to the restraint. The fixed position allowed the figure to see only a limited range of movement, framing each passerby within a narrow field of view, shaped by the upward angle of the head. Rain produced a different atmosphere entirely. Droplets fell freely on the raised arms, gathering at the cuffs and traveling downward. The metal cooled quickly, creating a sharper contrast against warm skin. Clothing absorbed moisture until it clung closely to the body. Water gathered beneath the beam and formed small puddles that reflected the muted light of the sky. Despite the discomfort, the posture remained unchanged. The manacles held the wrists firmly in place, demanding stillness even as weather shifted around them. By late afternoon, the strain deepened. Shoulders trembled with fatigue. The muscles along the back tightened into persistent ache. The hands swelled slightly from their elevated position, creating tingling sensations that faded and returned in cycles. The posture allowed breathing but altered its rhythm, encouraging shorter, more deliberate inhales as the chest grew tired from the upward stretch. When attendants finally returned, their approach signaled the end of the restraint. They opened each cuff with slow, controlled movements. As the wrists slipped free, the individual lowered their arms with care, feeling the weight return to natural alignment. Blood moved downward in a warm rush, creating tingling relief along the arms and hands. The body adjusted gradually, stretching and rolling the shoulders to ease lingering tension. Once unoccupied, the manacles returned to their gentle sway. The beam above held them steady, reflecting a quiet readiness for their next use. Though simple in construction, the restraint relied on time, posture, and the body's response to stillness under tension. It transformed a standing position into a prolonged challenge shaped entirely by endurance. Through their silent design, the hanging manacles revealed how the body adapts, resists, and eventually yields to immobility. In the open air beneath the beam, they created a space where the passage of hours became the central force, and where movement once restored felt profoundly unfamiliar. The pit of withholding lay partially concealed beneath a wooden platform, its opening framed by rough planks and supported by beams strengthened over many seasons. Unlike other methods, it relied neither on height nor pressure, but on gradual reduction of movement, of warmth, of sensation. When viewed from above, the pit appeared shallow at first glance, though its interior widened slightly beneath the surface, creating a confined space that shaped the experience through enclosure rather than force. Attendants began by guiding the individual toward the edge of the platform. The descent required stepping down a simple wooden ladder, its rungs smooth from use, and its sides marked by faint grooves where hands had grasped for balance. As the individual entered the space, the air grew cooler, carrying the scent of earth that had absorbed moisture through countless cycles of weather. The pit offered enough height to stand, though the walls pressed close. Movement remained possible, but limited to small shifts of posture. Once inside, the ladder was withdrawn, and the wooden cover slid gently across the opening. It did not seal the pit completely. Narrow gaps between the planks allowed thin lines of light to filter downward. These slivers illuminated the interior in faint patterns, casting irregular stripes along the rough walls and ground. The patchwork of light changed gradually through the day as the sun shifted overhead. Stillness defined the early moments. Footsteps above faded as attendants walked away, leaving only the subtle sounds within the pit breath echoing softly against the walls, fabric settling, and the occasional small shift of dirt beneath the feet. The enclosure did not compress the body, yet it shaped movement with quiet boundaries. Turning required care to avoid brushing against the walls. Sitting demanded slow adjustment. Standing became the primary posture, encouraged by the limited space and cool earth. The environment outside continued its rhythm, though it reached the pit in softened tones. Voices from above arrived muted, forming indistinct layers of sound. Wooden carts passing over the platform created faint vibrations that moved through the beams and into the air below. Wind sounded distant. Its presence felt only when it slipped through the cracks of the cover, stirring the cool air within. Light moved in slow arcs across the interior. Morning brought angled slivers that created thin, bright shapes along the walls. Midday softened the patterns into a diffuse glow. As afternoon progressed, the stripes of illumination faded gradually until the pit held only muted, blue-gray tones. When clouds drifted overhead, the interior dimmed further, leaving the figure to rely more on sound and touch than sight. Temperature played a subtle but constant role. The earth retained coolness that seeped into the air, brushing against exposed skin and settling around the lower legs. In dry weather, dust floated gently, rising slightly each time the figure shifted position. In damp conditions, moisture formed along the walls, collecting in small beads before sliding downward and pooling lightly at the base. The air remained still, shaped by the narrow passages through which it entered. Time revealed itself most clearly through posture. Standing remained steady at first, but as the hours progressed, muscles in the calves and lower back tightened from lack of space to walk or stretch. Sitting offered temporary relief, but the uneven ground and the closeness of the walls limited comfort. The body alternated between postures, standing, crouching, leaning, each providing only partial respite from the growing stiffness. Sound inside the pit shifted subtly as the day unfolded. In the morning, activity above created layers of movement, voices, footsteps, the clatter of tools. By afternoon, these sounds softened as fewer people passed near the platform. In the evening, the environment quieted further until only distant echoes and the soft hum of wind remained. The pit, unaffected by these changes, held its steady stillness as daylight faded. Darkness arrived gradually. The final lines of light narrowed, then disappeared, leaving the interior in shadow. Eyes adjusted slowly, recognizing faint outlines only when the surface above caught a reflection of the fading sky. In darkness, the sense of enclosure deepened, not through pressure, but through the absence of visual reference. Breathing became the primary indicator of space, its sound marking the boundaries of the interior. When attendants returned, the first sign came through footsteps above, soft, measured, and familiar. The cover slid open, allowing light to spill downward in widening shapes. The ladder descended once more, its rungs creaking slightly as it settled into place. The figure climbed upward slowly, emerging into the open air where movement felt expansive after the hours below. Muscles stretched cautiously, adjusting to the freedom outside the confined space. Once empty, the pit remained quiet. Its walls held a sense of stillness that belonged to spaces shaped by endurance rather than force. The wooden cover slid back into position, leaving the interior in darkness, until it was needed again. The pit required no elaborate mechanisms. Its design relied on enclosure, time, and the body's natural response to limited space. Through its silent depth, the pit of withholding revealed how confinement without pressure, without noise, without spectacle, could transform the experience of stillness. It turned breath into rhythm, shadows into markers of time, and simple standing into a quiet measure of endurance beneath the surface of an open world.